Acharya as well. And with this, and another thing before I start, so that is a great opportunity. Why? Because it's a very mixed crowd. So the audience is, as I found from Daya Shankar, that it's a very mixed audience, and there are actually many assistant professors, associate professors, and also research scholars. So mostly from colleges and a few from the universities, and also research scholars, advanced research scholars. So it's a very interesting and challenging job for me. And as you have found from the schedule, that it's essentially I will be actually presenting the course. It's a quick refresher course on macroeconomics, etc. So basically, during this course or through this course, if Daya Shankar permits, it might be a two-phase course, that is today and tomorrow. So I'll be a bit slow. I'm really grateful to Daya Shankar, because otherwise, because of some health issues, I'm a bit slow these days for a month or so. So it's better for me that I have some breathing time. It's great. So thank you, Daya Shankar. Thanks a lot. So, and this quick refresher course, actually, through this, I will try to cover 20th century macroeconomics, the mainstream 20th century macroeconomics. So 20th century means, as you know, all of you, because you are highly advanced academicians. So that macroeconomics started with John Maynard Keynes. So as a separate discipline, definitely there was macroeconomics. It's foolish to say that macroeconomics started with John Maynard Keynes. So basically, as a separate discipline, it came into being through the works of John Maynard Keynes, the famous general theory. So it is 1930s roughly, and then I'll end, say, coming to 1995, 2000 roughly, and mainly focusing on the mainstream first of all, and then among the mainstream or within the mainstream, the main discourses, the main schools of thought, the fundamental schools of thought. I will not be covering, first of all, the non-mainstream macroeconomics. There is a very interesting non-mainstream macroeconomics, and very interestingly, which started from 1930s only. In fact, few of the writings, fundamental writings of non-mainstream macroeconomics, were published prior to Keynes's general theory. In fact, when Lord Keynes was discussing general theory in the evening meetings in Cambridge, there are nice stories. So in those meetings, few people used to raise questions, and it was found that they already had published those things which Lord Keynes was discussing. So it's very interesting, but unfortunately, I won't be covering. So it started from 1930s as a separate discipline. I'm talking about not macroeconomics, because if you go to classical political economy, macroeconomics was there in Marx, in Ricardo, in Malthus, even in the case of Adam Smith, and definitely in the case of Marx and Ricardo, there was macroeconomics. But macroeconomics was not under political economy. Everything was there. But macroeconomics as a separate discipline started during 30s, and it's very interesting to see that macroeconomics mainstream and macroeconomics heterodox or non-mainstream both started roughly during 1930s. But unfortunately, I won't be able to get time or that much of physical strength to take 4 classes. It's not possible. So I'll be focusing on mainstream macroeconomics, and within that mainstream, only those schools which are extremely important to understand the debate, the reality that we are having in the 21st century. So that these are the limitations, that I won't be going for the heterodox or non-mainstream, and within the mainstream, only few schools, major schools. Number one, and number two, before I start, it might be pretty boring among for many of you, unfortunately, because many of you are masters of macroeconomics. So for them, unfortunately, I can't. I just can tell. Sorry that you have to bear with me, because but I find that macroeconomics is not first love for most of the people, and in most of the actually we had a day long, just 12 hours interview yesterday, where very few people told us that macroeconomics is their first choice. So that gave me some courage that I can present the old wine in a new bottle, nothing else. So it's absolutely old wine, and I don't know whether it's a new bottle, might be polished bottle, a old bottle, polished. Maximum I can say that. And if you find it interesting, then I am happy. My presentation is fruitful. Otherwise, please forgive me. And another thing, before I start, you definitely raise questions. I can't see you, absolutely. And I have in front of me, because I have switched off my video as well to save data. Not data, actually, otherwise it will be too slow. So I can't see anything except my presentation. So you have to immediately shout that I have a question. So otherwise, it's just I'm talking to my laptop. It's funny these days. I'm not even seeing the people through video. So with this, so please shout that I have a question, because if you raise hands, nothing will happen. Or at least you have to tell, you have to knock at Daya Shankar place, Daya Shankar's connection, and then he would ask, shouting, that there is a question. So please, that is very important. Otherwise, it is not possible to actually discuss roughly 50 slides. So I have 50 slides, and 2 days are fantastic that Daya Shankar has given me. So I'll be slow. So first of all, as I have written there, what is theory? That is, I'm not discussing what is theory. I'll just tell you something which needs to be kept in mind. That theory is nothing but storytelling. So internally consistent storytelling based on certain axioms. So axioms can come from books, literature. Axioms can come from observations. Great theories of the world in all time, you won't find that based on, that are definitely not based on empirics. No question. Great theories are coming from, are being discovered from two sources, mostly combining two sources: past knowledge and observation of the theoretician. Great theoreticians are great observers, great philosophers actually. Dakha, philosophy in Bengali is darshan, or in Sanskrit, I'm sorry, in Sanskrit is darshan. So it's a better thing actually. Dakha, it's to see, that observation, to observe is very important. So combining past knowledge and observation, the theorist, the master theorist, gives us a story. So based on, those are axioms based on story, and the story has to be internally consistent. Like, if you start with your story with the assumption that there is something called gravitational pull G, at the end of the story, you can't say G is equal to 0. So that internal consistency has to be there. But what is the task of a theory? The task of a theory is just to explain the reality. That is what I mean to say by this, what is theory? Because it's a fantastic topic, and I don't have the capacity to discuss everything. But for you, this is very important, that a theory means storytelling based on as axioms, based on observation and knowledge, past knowledge, and the story has to be internally consistent. And what for the story is? The story is meant for explaining reality. So it's like this. The same thing, two people are seeing and two people are explaining in two different ways. Like Kalidas and Boraho, they were going along with Vikramaditya. And in front of, in the forest, in front of the chariot, Vikramaditya found a piece of, tree has fallen, and it's in front of them. Then he asked Borahos, and then he replied that Shushkang Kashtang Tishtati Agre. So it's basically a dried wood, Shushkang Kashtang Tishtati Agre, which is very, very understandable. And then he asked Kalidasho. Kalidas replies, Nirasho Torubaro Purato Bhati. So it's basically looking at the same thing, telling it differently, and focusing on different aspects. So let us go into the basic theory now, the macroeconomics, the theory of macroeconomics. First of all, what is macroeconomics? The first paragraph, please have a look. Macroeconomics is the study of the structure and performance of large-scale economies, typically national economies. And in my lecture, the next part will be the target, because I don't have 20 lectures, I have 2 lectures only. And it was actually 1 lecture. It's fortunate I have 2. Policies that governments use to try to affect economic performance. So why macroeconomics is so unpopular? Because it is mostly taught and discussed as just a very shushkang kashtang. It's not a shushkang kashtang at all. It is actually a fantastic theory which has ingrained inherent political economy. So basically macroeconomics is why there was macroeconomics by Keynes, why it was introduced by Keynes to combat depression, Great Depression of Europe and America. So basically macroeconomics came up as a problem-solving device. So it was a theory which would explain and which would also try to give us some tool or instrument with which we can solve the problem. So explaining the problem and giving us the tools. That is the task of the theory. So here I will focus on the next part, that is the tool part. The policies that governments use to try, and history of policies we'll see, definitely focusing on or based on the theoretical frameworks. But every time when I introduce every school, the focus or final target is policy analysis and policy debate. So please try to understand, my focus is second part, that is basically, I will not just explain structures, but also explain with more focus the policies which come out of the structures. And at the end of the day, maybe today or tomorrow, you'd understand that macroeconomics is a value-loaded thing. It's not just a TARS theoretical framework, and it's a combatant. It's a field which is contentious. It's not just theory after theory. It's extremely contentious. It's a heavily loaded battleground that you will understand. And as it is not taught, or in petty textbooks, it is not written like that, it becomes a very pale, very stale and stale something which is tasteless. So unfortunately, that is not the task of macroeconomics at all. It's a very lively thing, in fact, more lively than microeconomics, much more. So unfortunately or fortunately, and so I would say unfortunately, this is the problem. So with this, I am not going to the second paragraph. I simply go to, I'm sorry. The second slide. So I have sent this already. I don't know. I think Dayashankar, have they received this?
Yes, sir. I already.
Yes, sir.
Yesterday.
Okay.
Yes,
Very,
sir.
very good. So, okay. So basically, you just focus on. So first of all, so school by school, I will go school by school. So first of all, I will go to the classical school, which is prior to Keynes. Now, I told you that macroeconomics started with 1930s with Keynes. Now I am telling, prior to Keynes, there was something called classical macroeconomics, the first column. Then you would say, why are you telling 1930s? actually, as I told you, as a separate discipline, classical macroeconomics was non-existent. Classical macroeconomics, this classical term that you find here actually is coined by Keynes. It is not classical political economy. You can see my cursor?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So the classical political economy is separate. This classical is what Keynes gave us the idea, classical. And he meant by classical Marshall, Walra, Pigou. Marshall, Walra, Pigou. They were writing during the end 19th century and early 20th century, before 1930s. And you know, they have none of them has written any book called macroeconomics. And that's why it was basically political economy, principles of political economy, principles of taxation, etc., etc. So, or market analysis, something like that. So it's basically, they were talking about, so Keynes extracted from their works the macroeconomics part, and he called that these are the features of classical macroeconomics. But don't think that classical macroeconomics existed as a separate discipline. It is coinage by Keynes. You would find it at the end of the general theory, the book. So let us go into this, and most of you know these things. So I told you, initially it might be a bit boring, but I find it very interesting at the end of the day. I don't know what you will feel. So first of all, we know,
Hello.
yes.
Hello, good evening, sir.
Good evening. Yes.
Sir, is there any contribution by Karl Marx also for
No,
giving the...
definitely not. Here, there is no contribution of Karl Marx. In this classical, there is no question of Karl Marx. Karl Marx, classical political economy, as I told you, is Smith, Ricardo, Malthus, these people, which was criticized by Marx. So Marx could not be clubbed even in the classical political economy. So Marx is separate. And here we just are forgetting these people, everyone. This classical is just Marshall, Pigou, Walra. So it's actually end 19th century and early 20th century. But they are also taking something from fundamental issues are coming from J.B. Say, most probably 1806, very early part of the 19th century or late 18th century matter. Basically, it was 1806 or something, most probably, that, as far as I can remember. So Say's law of markets, everybody knows that. So I'm just quickly reading, passing through this, because I will be needing this. And that's why I'm actually focusing. Just a second, please. অপূর্বদা, আমি একটা লেকচারে আছি গো, ওই যে আমি কিছু এমার্জেন্সি। হ্যাঁ গো, হ্যালো, হ্যাঁ পরে রাতে, হ্যাঁ ওই লেকচারে পরে রাতের দিকে করি। Okay, so the second is, this is very important, competitive. So they were writing for, as I told you, everyone is explaining reality. And what was the reality for them? It was competitive capitalism without market power. Then the next one, if you look at, it is commodity. And they are in the classical framework, there were commodity, money, labor, and loanable fund markets, all in equilibrium, that we know. And also, you know, perfectly flexible price, wage, rate of interest, these things generate general equilibrium with no excess supply, excess demand, and no excess capacity, and no involuntary unemployment. So these are all pretty undergraduate stuff. So I won't spend much time at all. So, and you know, but there are certain issues which we miss, like it's a competitive capitalism. Don't forget that, please. And other things are all written in textbook, but this is not written, unfortunately, that it is actually meant for a competitive capitalism, 18th century, 19th century phenomenon. And there was boom, the booming economy. It's not Great Depression. It was an economy where capitalism was thriving over hundreds of years. Over centuries, capitalism was thriving. So booming economy, generally moving along the long run, potential output, etc. Potential output, I'm not going. Just it's a booming economy. And there is free market smoothly functioning. There is no market power, as I have mentioned. These are not written in the textbooks generally, which you have to keep in mind if you have to properly teach the students. Full employment with only voluntary unemployment, we know this in textbook itself. No involuntary. This is textbook stuff. But it's a free market, smoothly functioning, and it's a capitalism with it, which is basically a competitive capitalism. These are extremely important. Otherwise, you won't understand the later part of macroeconomics, the debate, etc. Then money has three functions: unit of account, measure of value, medium of exchange, undergraduate staff, and hence only transaction precautionary demand for money. There is no speculative demand for money, as you know. Aggregate supply curve comes from the representative input market, that is labor market, that you know. And aggregate supply curve is vertical, that you know, and curve at a point of time. It's basically something like this, that you have a long run path, and at each time point on the path there is one vertical aggregate supply curve. It's like that. So I'm not going into that. If somebody asks question, I can explain. Otherwise I won't, because I don't need these things for today, for squeezing the lecture. Aggregate supply, aggregate demand curve comes from, we know, rectangular hyperbola. Just that is fine for senior people. Then you have rectangular hyperbola, and we know in classical system, fiscal policy fully ineffective. This is actually our target. Constantly, we will be focusing on the policy issue tonight. That is our target, actually. 14 and 15. This is the debate. We will focus. And to do the debate, to participate in the debate, actually we need the theoretical framework. Otherwise, no. So fiscal policy fully ineffective via the loanable fund market, where fully flexible rate of interest equilibrates demand for fund, loanable fund, and supply of loanable fund automatically and in due course. So there is no friction in, and there is the fiscal policy is fully ineffective. Monetary policy creates inflation. It's even worse. There is classical dichotomy. We know that neutrality of money, etc. We don't know that, and money is a veil. We know these things. So why I am stating these things? Because just to have a recapitulation, so that we can go to the debate. Slowly, we are going into the debate. Initially, it might be pretty boring. Maybe in the later half or tomorrow, it might create some star in our deliberations. So it's long run, and it's long run. I didn't mention very clearly there. So it's long run situation. There is Say's law I have mentioned. There is classical dichotomy I have mentioned. And you know, this is the scenario. Everyone knows this. So it's very quickly. This is the supply of loanable fund. I think you can see my cursor moving. The red one is the demand for loanable fund. Why it is so? Because it is savings actually. Savings means what? Savings is kept in banks, and from the banks, actually people take loan and they invest. So that's why savings is supply of loanable fund, and investment is demand for loanable fund. And there is equilibrium through perfectly flexible rate of interest movement. And that is why this is basically savings and investment equality. But this is fundamentally giving you the saving investment equality. Basically it's a loanable fund. It's a market is the loanable fund market. And from there, A star, I star, R star, and from I star definitely will get K star, the amount of capital stock in the economy that you get. Then from there, you can come here. But before that, let us go to the labor market. And you know, classical labor market is simple. There is labor supply curve, there is labor demand curve. Now, labor supply curve comes from labor leisure choice. Labor demand curve comes from profit maximization. There is full employment. This is called full employment situation in the sense that there may be voluntary unemployment, but no involuntary unemployment. And from there, what we get N star and we get WYP star. So from this market, labor market, we get these two variables, and from here we get K, especially N and K. Once we mix these things, we get some Y. And this is our Y given the level of N star. So we get N star from here, and we put N star here, and we put K here, and given our N star, we get our Y star, and this Y star we put here. So it's Y star, it's fixed. So it's Y star. Now, where is the guarantee that? So what we are telling here, there is a labor supply curve, ceteris paribus. There is a labor demand curve, ceteris paribus. There is employment, and we got K from here. So we have a production function given the technology F. We have a production function, and from there we get something. As N star is fixed from here, we get Y star, and we put it here. Means there is supply. Now, where is the guarantee that this supply will be demanded? The producers would be able to sell this output. Where is the guarantee? The guarantee is in Say's law. That's why Say's law is extremely important for classical framework. Why I'm telling that? It means what? It means the demand is not a problem at all. If you, and you know this, for you it's obvious, this is the rectangular hyperbola. That is basically your aggregate demand curve. So if the demand curve is here, if the demand curve is here, or whether the demand curve is here, absolutely immaterial. It only determines the price. It has nothing to do with output. It has nothing to do with employment. It has nothing to do with real wage. What does this mean? It means supply, creates its own demand. And why it is so? Why I am putting it before the learned audience? It means that you don't have to bother about demand. And demand, you don't have to be bothered about demand. And one of the most crucial sources of demand is government. So you don't have to be bothered about the role of the government so far as demand is concerned. So government becomes redundant. In the classical, what was the target of classical macroeconomists? They were not macroeconomists. They were classical economists coined by Keynes, as assigned, the name was designed by or coined by Keynes. Why they were writing? They were trying to write something where they were trying to put market as supreme. So this is a market, this is a market, and this is also a market. Market is such that there is no role for government. The government has only one role, that is governance. It's so interesting. In 2014, in 2010, in 2014, in 2020, after 2000, we are telling that maximum governance and minimum government. We told this 100 years back. The classical economists' sole target was to show that, look, market as an institution is fantastic. You don't have to think about that because it can generate its own equilibrium. Leave it. The state should not interfere. The state should not create any trouble, because if the state intervenes, there are troubles. You know from your teachings, you know from your own reading and teachings that if government intervenes, then there are troubles in classical model. And that is actually the bone of contention. So classical economists tried to, like Walra, the great economists like Marshall, Walra, especially Walra and Marshall, they tried to establish that the hegemony of market, that market, that is a fantastic innovation of humanity which can solve its problems. And the government is there to create troubles. It's a nuisance. That is fundamental. And if you don't, at the very beginning, introduce this issue, then you should not study macroeconomics. Because macroeconomics without this is absolutely useless. So that is the target. Through this simple diagram, what they are telling is that, look, loanable fund market, labor market, simple production function, technology, engineering, this is basically engineering, no economics. And these markets are so interesting that they can generate the destiny, the output, and the destiny, the employment. And then if you bring in government too much, then the price will be too high. If it is too less, the price is less, and inflation is bad. It violates, vitiates the whole environment, in the sense that all the expectations are destroyed, are badly affected. So you should not create trouble for the economy. The economy is so nicely organized. Market. So market is created by humanity. Is the task of macroeconomics.
Sir, your voice is breaking.
Any question? Otherwise, I go to the next.
Sir,
Yes, please.
you are not clearly audible.
At
Sir,
all.
your voice is
For how
breaking,
long?
sir.
For how long?
Sir, just for
For
2
few-
minutes.
Yes, sir.
2 minutes ago.
Oh, that I can't do anything because my everything is running. I go out and then come back. Oh, tell you this. Hello, hello. Is it
Yes,
better?
sir. Clear.
Uh-huh.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Maybe the volume has reduced automatically. So this is, that the simple textbook thing. I don't need to. It's very bad. It's neutrality of money. When the money supply rises, the rectangular hyperbola shifts, and there is inflation, and that is very bad for the economy, because when there is inflation, you cannot plan your future, and if you cannot plan, then you cannot take decision in the current period as well. You cannot perform properly in the current period. Yeah. Just a second. Hello,
Yes, sir.
audible?
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
sir, audible.
Right
Sir,
now
I
you're
had a
audible.
question. Can I
Yes,
ask now?
yes. Regarding this,
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
yes, ask.
Sir, we had savings as leakages in classicals, yet there was prevalence of JS law. So how did it operate it? Because
Says
savings
law.
are some,
Savings.
yes, sir.
Absolutely. Very good question, but very simple answer. That the savings going to the bank, and when there is excess savings, that is the savings curve is shifting, the rate of interest falls, and that attracts investors. The investors are getting attracted to the funds, to the banks. They are taking loan and investing. So there is no mismatch between savings and investment. Whatever is saved is automatically invested in due course. It is long run. So in due course, it will be invested. So there is no surplus savings. There is no surplus savings means what? Savings is basically the other side of the coin, where one side of the coin, where on the other side you have surplus inventory. So whatever is saved is invested means what? The investor, there is no inventory accumulation. It is used up. So you are producing machines, but you cannot sell. Why? Because people are saving. Fine. People are saving means it's going to the investment through banks, going to the banking sector, then getting invested, and through investment, the excess machines would be utilized. So there is no glut. There is no excess supply. Whatever is supplied, look at the fourth diagram, number 4. Whatever is supplied is fully demanded. Only the price varies. Price is a question, but whether your product will be sold or not is absolutely irrelevant. So supply is fundamental. You just go on supplying, and that is the source of supply side economics that we call supply side economics. You just create infrastructure. You just create bridges and roads and ports, airports, and manufacturing units and service units. Don't think about demand, because supply will automatically create its demand. There will be no glut and unnecessary. So, and that will be created through market. So unnecessarily, don't invite the government, the troublemaker. It's a necessary evil, necessary in not in economic sense, maybe in political sense, maybe in terms of law. Maintaining law and order, maintaining property rights structure, you may need government. For maintaining, governing, you may need government. But for government as a demand generator is a nuisance. So we go to, and that is the nuisance. The government is raising money, supply, and that is creating inflation. So it's a nuisance. And I'm not going into these details unless and otherwise there is question, because these are all undergraduate stuff. And then that there is expanding bond market. It's better to write bond market. So expanding bond market. Basically, if you have, so earlier one was money supply. That is, it's monetary policy. I'm sorry. The earlier one was monetary policy. It was basically monetary policy. The next one is fiscal policy. Why fiscal policy is ineffective? It's very simple, because initially it was investment, then the government comes with tax, and so this is G minus T is a positive, deficit is positive, G minus T is positive, so there is a shift here. And then what happens? Now the question is, G minus T is positive, means what? Government is spending more than the income of the government. Now, from where the government is getting this money? The government is getting this money through bond finance. Means what? They are actually supplying bond in the market, and thereby through bond selling, they are mopping up money from people. They are mopping up money from the private banking system, because during that time the banking system was also privatized. It was not public banking system that we have, State Bank of India, Reserve Bank of India, like that. This was not, though maybe Reserve Bank of India kind of thing was there, but definitely not widely elaborate. And we are going actually in that direction once again, where we are going to privatize everything. So you think of the situation where the government is selling the bonds, and the bonds are bought by mostly the rich people, the banks, the rich companies, rich people bank. And so it's a bond financed. So what the government is doing, the government is putting excess demand for loanable fund in the fund. So taking away money from, not snatching away, taking money from banks, taking money from people. From where? From their consumption? No, from their savings. And
Hello, sir, you are not audible properly
Sir.
again.
Yes, sir, your voice is again breaking.
Sir, you are not audible at all now.
He's trying to fix the things. Is it? স্যার ওটাকে কিবোর্ড দিয়ে বাড়ান তো সাউন্ডটাকে। F3 দিয়ে। No, sir. Yes.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, sir.
ঠিক আছে, আমি ইচ্ছে করে বেরিয়ে গিয়ে আবার ঢুকলাম।
Huh.
আমি আবার একটু শেয়ার করছি। দেখা যাচ্ছে?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
ঠিক আছে, ওকে। আমি জানি না, যাই হোক, এসব হবে, প্রথম হবে, পরের দিকেও হবে কিনা জানি না, এই তো মুশকিল। দয়াশঙ্কর,
Yes, sir.
how many participants are there?
Sir, 17.
Total, this is the strength, or the
20,
strength is
20 strength.
okay. So 3 are absent.
They are not getting their connection, sir.
Oh.
It is there from their part.
Okay, I understand. Okay, so here what is happening, the government now, am I audible now?
Yes, sir.
That's it.
Yes, sir, you are audible.
Okay, so might be trouble, so I have to go out and I have to come back once again. So it might happen that I shall have to go out and I shall have to come back. So please let me know whenever I'm not audible. So here basically G is greater than T. So somehow government has to manage fund. What does the government do? It sells bond to the people, especially to banks. The banks are having surplus loanable fund. So there is excess demand for loanable fund, and that's why we go to, when there is rise in G, we go to loanable fund market. Otherwise, people might be surprised that why I am going to loanable fund market when we are talking about G. When we are talking about G, why are we going to the loanable fund market? Because what is happening here, it's not money supply, it is not through printing money, because the printing money case is the previous one. You can see the other slide where printing money case we have, where there is inflation. But this slide, it is not printing money. You can't print money. So what can you do? You just sell your bond in the market, get the money from banks, but by that you are actually creating excess demand for, you can see my cursor, I suppose, excess demand. This is excess demand for, and I, I is demand for loanable fund, and S is supply of loanable fund, that. So this is excess demand for loanable fund, and the price will rise. That is the basic economics. The price of loanable fund is rate of interest, so it starts rising. It starts rising from R1 to R2, but as it starts rising, investment falls, because I is a function of R, I is dependent on R. Investment falls and savings rises. And when there is rise in savings, it's basically given. In our earlier slide, we had Y star, or income given the income, Y star given the income. When savings is rising, consumption must fall. So when G is rising, two things are falling. First, I is falling, and then C is also falling. And it is absolutely easy. I'm not going into this discussion. It will be shown that C plus I fall is just equal to rise in G. So the government expenditure policy is also completely nullified. So government is a nuisance. First of all, through fiscal policy or government expenditure policy, it cannot do anything. And if it tries to print money, it creates inflation. So government is a nuisance. The market is supreme. The market on its own can nicely solve its problems of excess supply or excess demand. There may be excess supply or excess demand temporarily, but permanently it cannot be there. In due course, there is no excess supply, excess demand, neither in the commodity market, nor in the money market, nor in the labor market. So government is a nuisance. That is basically the political economic, you could say what do I say, the proposition that comes out of the storytelling, the way they told the story, that look, this is the market economy, And from there, you see the government at best or at worst can generate inflation, but it has no other role to play. It is absolutely useless. Am I audible? Am I clear?
Yes, sir.
Am I,
Yes,
is
sir.
it visible?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So with this, I stop with classical. It's over. If there is any question, please ask on classical. And I'll go to Keynesian with all the three columns, simple Keynesian model, ISLM model, and CKM together. So in my slides, I'll present separately, but here I will read together because lots of things are common. So we will have these three together now. Please let me know if there is any question from classical. I suppose there is no, so I go to simple Keynesian, ISLM and CKM together, and it was introduced by Keynes. This ISLM was actually introduced by Hicks and Hansen, and there is a kind of synthesis between classical and Keynes while designing ISLM framework. Why it's classical, I'll tell later. And then it is Keynes. And then in all three, there is effective demand problem, which is very important. There is effective demand problem, effective demand. But here you see there are additional problems as well. And I'll come to that later on. Now, what is effective demand problem? It's a very important issue. It means Keynes recognizes that. Acha, we proceed and then we'll discuss. Just we read as recapitulation. The effective demand problem due to nominal rigidities, especially money wage rigidity, and most importantly, aggregate demand rigidity. This later part is more important, but unfortunately not at all properly highlighted in textbooks. So please be careful. Effective demand problem, it is shown in textbook, arises because of wage rigidity, etc., which is absolutely wrong interpretation. Effective demand problem is much more fundamental. Effective demand problem is inherent in an advanced economy. Keynes was writing during 1930s. You have to keep in mind, and that we are coming into. So it is advanced capitalism with excess capacity unemployment due to effective demand problem. It is also advanced capitalism with this same thing. This is same thing. This is all the same for all three. And where is the difference? Here it's competitive capitalism. Here it's advanced capitalism. There is a big difference between the contexts. The classical economists were writing for an economy which is a competitive capitalism, which is a nascent, which is just an upcoming capitalism, which is a growing, upcoming, developing, spreading capitalism. But Keynes was writing about a capitalism which is monopoly capitalism, which is advanced capitalism, which is almost a full-fledged monopoly capitalism. So it's different. That you have to understand. Now, what is the meaning of this, etc., we will discuss later on when we arrive at those points when this becomes relevant. But this is extremely important. We never tell our students, or definitely I can't say not all of us, but the textbooks actually I can guarantee no textbook would tell you that, look, the context is different. As if classical economics is talking about market, Keynesian economics is talking about the same market. The whole animal is different. The whole context is different. The whole situation is different. It is a new kind of capitalism that we are seeing in the 20th century. And that's why the old knowledge is redundant. Unfortunately, the books, how can the books do that? The great people, I'm not talking about just the petty notebooks like Bhattacharya and Schorkel. I'm talking about Dornbusch Fischer. I'm talking about Mankiw. I'm talking about Freund. Talking about other like those masters' great books that we use, Blanchard, Fischer, or Romer. Nowhere you would find this recognition that, look, this is a different kind of scenario altogether. Next, there are commodity market explicitly analyzed. Oh, here there are certain differences, SKM, ISLM, CKM as well, that we'll be discussing. But these two are extremely fundamental. Now, let us discuss this for some time. Let us spend some time for this, because this is extremely important to understand to a 2021 economy as well, 2021's economy, that it is advanced capitalism. And in advanced capitalism, inherently, there is one problem called effective demand problem. That is, there is possibility of glut. That is, there is a possibility of excess supply. Why? There are various reasons. Number one, why demand? There is a possibility or tendency of shortfall of demand. Why it is inherent? Why I'm telling it is so fundamental? There are various reasons. One by one, very quickly, I'm going through. If questions come, then I can discuss. First of all, in advanced capitalism, demand, what are the components of demand? C, I, G, X minus M. So definitely, if there is lack of demand, there must be some lack, some gap in C, I, G, X minus M. And fundamentally, C and I, because G is government, it is autonomous, and X minus M is beyond my capacity, largely, especially for smaller countries. So it's C and I. Must be there are something seriously problematic, and that's why there is lack of demand. In advanced capitalism, actually, there is lot of consumption already, and that's why when you generate income, only a part of that income is consumed and a major part is saved. And that is actually our fundamental assumption of Keynesian consumption function, that C prime greater than 0 less than 1. Unfortunately, the textbooks tell us this so naively, so badly, so mechanically. C prime greater than 0 less than 1. When Y rises, C rises less than proportionately. Why? A few years back, 5-6 years back, one of my students, he raised the question when I was teaching this. Sir, from NREGS money, this MG NREGA money, I found in my village, whatever they get, they spend everything. So this Keynesian economics is redundant. You are telling C prime less than 1, but it's not happening. That was a fantastic question, actually. Because what he was seeing is not advanced capitalism, is something else. Advanced capitalism means the overall standard of living is so high that when you give people money, mostly it will be saved. So when Y rises, means income rises, and at the background, output rises, otherwise where from income will come? Output rises, demand is not rising equiproportionately. And that is, unfortunately, it is not told in the textbooks. Nowhere it is written that, look, it is because of advanced capitalism. It is not something mechanical which was discovered by Lord Keynes. Absolutely bizarre kind of presentations in textbooks, I must confess. So please be aware. I think many of you know these things, but for some, maybe there are some gaps, and that's why I'm discussing. Second, when there is lack of consumption, the investors are hesitant. Why should I invest? Because consumption is the largest part.
Sir,
I
again
cannot
you
hear
are
you.
Then why should I invest? So
I cannot
consumption is
hear
not
you.
following. Hello?
sir, you are not properly audible again.
আবার কেটে গেল।
মানে
Hello, now?
হ্যাঁ, it's okay now.
ওই আওয়াজটা better. I mean, I'm not using the microphone. Now am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Hello?
Yes, sir, audible.
Is it better?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes,
sir, you're audible.
Is automatically reducing the voice. It is controlling, it is caring about my ears, and that's why it is automatically reducing the
But actually not reducing your voice. Your voice was breaking.
breaking.
And sometimes, yes, your voice was breaking, and sometimes your voice become more heavy.
Oh, that means it's because of internet. It's not the headphone. So I can't do, unfortunately, anything. Unfortunate, very unfortunate. That's why when I started, I told I'm switching off my video, because I know during evenings it's horrible. Uh, let us try, and if it is not audible, please let me know. I'll repeat.
Now it's
So
okay, sir.
now it's okay. Okay, thank you. Please remind me. Please tell me, because I can be slower. I can repeat. Okay. So in advanced capitalism, actually, there is lot of C already, lot of I already, lot of capacity has been produced, lot of infrastructure has been produced. So why should I invest suddenly if there is no guarantee that my investment will be highly profitable? Who will guarantee? Because there is no government. Government is a nuisance, and we have removed government from almost all economic interventions prior to, say, without war, government has nothing to do, almost anything, nothing to do, almost nothing to do, government, except the First World War and other governmental governance kind of things. So there's no guarantee. So that is the most fundamental, I won't say most fundamental, one of the most fundamental reasons for effective demand problem. The context is advanced capitalism. If we forget, then we actually are not telling anything to our students. And unfortunately, most of us may be telling these things to our students, but fortunately our textbooks do not. So I request my colleagues here and would-be researchers here and the current researchers and would-be colleagues here to write good textbooks as well. So that is one. Number two, in advanced capitalism, according to Keynes, actually this is the reason what he tried to indicate at. That look, in advanced capitalism, there is inherent problem of C and I. But there could be other reasons as well, but that is exactly not Keynesian. Like in a bit of Marxian, like in advanced capitalism, there is very skewed income distribution. The most of the income is in the current global scenario. Just think of the income distribution. Every year, the big companies and big NGOs, they actually, Oxfam or others, they give us data on inequality, global inequality. It's highly skewed, and the overwhelming majority of the global income or capitalists' income, the country's income, is held by the capitalists, whose MPC is very low. We know that. And millions of, in fact, billions of people are actually holding a minuscule part of the income, whose MPC, unfortunately and ironically, is very high. So overall consumption intensity, overall demand through consumption is very low because of this peculiar skewedness of income. So this is another reason, and there are other reasons as well, but I won't go into those things now today, because I have told you that I'll stick to mainstream. Many fantastic non-mainstream arguments are there, to which are actually, these are not just arguments, they are very nice theories which can, and that is the task of the theory, explain why there is effective demand problem, inherent effective demand problem. And effective demand problem is just not a transient problem. Definitely it's not a transient temporary problem of capitalism. It is a fundamental problem of capitalism which classical economists missed completely, and that is not their fault as a whole, because their world was different. It was a competitive capitalism where people were basically producing to survive. But here people are producing to accumulate, not survive. And when I am accumulating, then there is no pressure of consumption. Why should I invest? Why should I consume? More importantly, consume when I'm getting some money. There's no need, actually. It's all done. It's all over. I have everything to consume, and there is already huge, fantastic investment that has been done. And actually, we are trying to invest now, not globally, but we are thinking of intergalactic investments nowadays. So it's a lot of investment, a lot of consumption. And that's why I spent a lot of time on, because you have to understand this fundamental problem of capitalism. And there are other reasons as well, If at the end we have time discussion, we have on heterodox things, then we can discuss. Otherwise, I won't go into those very interesting explanations of the fundamental character of the problem of the fundamental character of the problem called effective demand problem, because it's very fundamental, it's inherent, it's integral part of capitalism that you have to understand, and it's not transient. It can go away for 10 years or 20 years, and people like Milton. So we go to the next one, and these are all known. It's commodity, first simple Keynesian model, it's commodity market. ISLM, there are commodity money and bond market, and CKM, there are 4 markets. So nothing to tell to senior researchers and teachers. So, and then perfectly inflexible price. This is very important. We have perfectly inflexible price here, perfectly inflexible price here as well. But here we have perfectly inflexible money wage, though price is not fully inflexible. And what is written over here, let me just read out. Perfectly inflexible price generates equilibrium in commodity money and bond market, but with excess capacity, unemployment in the economy. ISLM framework equilibrates goods and money market, and hence using all these blah blah blah, you know these things. So I'm not, it's not a full course like this, like that we teach in class. So I'm not going into it. Once needed, we can come back to these issues. So this is the scenario, and these are the and other things, you know, because this is what is important when we enter into Keynes, into the discussions of Keynes. Then the understanding of effective demand problem, and it's just not a case of money wage rigidity or somewhat flimsy rate of interest is constant. Why it is constant? Why it is so low? So these are the very important things that we'll discuss a bit when we proceed. But if there are questions, then we can also go much deeper. So I'm just skipping it because here these are all technical things most of you know. And finally, because I told you it's policy, so policy is important for us. Fiscal policy fully effective via multiplier process, we know that. So no price change because it's price fixed model, and money absent in simple Keynesian. ISLM, fiscal policy effective via multiplier process, the general case, no price change. However, crowding out effect dampens the power of fiscal policy, we know that. But horizontal LM curve, that is when we have, that is the liquidity trap. And when we have the liquidity trap, when it is deep depression, no crowding out COE is crowding out effect, although vertical in LM, that is full crowding out effect. That means we know these things, but we'll come to that. And then monetary policy is effective. We know these things, ISLM, monetary policy, and then SKM, fiscal policy, ISLM, fiscal policy, and CKM also fiscal and monetary policy, etc., etc. Just to have a recapitulation, I have written these things, and you have already got this table, so it's with you. And you know, effective demand problem is the fundamental thing. Here we have, as you know, the simple Keynesian cross model, we call it cross model. And what is important here, I would try to remind you, most of you know definitely, that this is actually our excess supply, excess capacity, not excess supply, I'm sorry, excess capacity scenario. So it's real GDP here. What is actually this dotted line, or 10 means the potential output, and 6 is the current output. And that is actually what we are talking about, that the shortage of demand, that is fundamental in advanced capitalism. And this fundamental shortage of demand is not just a transient phenomenon, it is inherent, because according to Keynes only, that if there is high C, already high C and I, then any additional income would lead to very little increase in C and I. And that's why when you try to produce more of output, there is always a fear that your output won't be sold out. You won't be able to sell your output because your C and I are not coming up commensurately, properly with your increase in output. Though you are producing output, giving money to people, but this money is not coming back through circular flow to you, because a lot is being saved Why people are not consuming everything? Because it's an advanced capitalistic scenario. That you have to understand, and multiplier and all these things. So I am moving forward. And then you have fiscal policy, government expenditure policy, which can push the economy from here to here. And you have multiplier, where when this is actually your total increase in output, your increase in expenditure is this, and that is your multiplier. Shall I discuss this? Any question from here? Otherwise, I will go to the ISLM. If there is any question from simple Keynesian framework or the basic simple Keynesian, it's obviously there would be no question. But from the framework, because you have already gone through the table, so if you can, if you have any question on the table for the second, third, and fourth column, please ask if there's any confusion. Otherwise, I'll go to ISLM very fast. Can you hear me?
No question, sir.
Okay. It's obvious, it's very simple. And then we come to ISLM, money market, commodity market, and bond market. And this is actually your commodity market. IS and LM is money market, and there is equilibrium where you have money market, commodity market equilibrium, and bond market equilibrium we have through Walras law that we know. So, and as it is written, the real and monetary sectors of the economy are resolved. So money matters to real sector outcomes. There is no dichotomy. So there is no dichotomy, the classical dichotomy, and that we have in the next slide, that when money supply rises, this is the scenario, this Keynes effect. Money supply rises, when there is excess money in the hands of the people, they try to put the money in the bond market, price of bond rises, rate of interest, there is inverse relationship, between price of bond and rate of interest. Rate of interest falls, and that's why investment rises, aggregate demand rises. And also you can take loans from consumer durables like car loans, and that's why C durables, consumption good, durable consumption good, and aggregate demand rises, price rises. So and what is very important is that when there is a rise in aggregate demand, then there's, I should have gone to this, then actually this is moving, and that's why there is maybe crowding out effect, but finally there is increase in output. Unfortunately, I have missed it. I should have written, first of all, after AD rise, there is rise in a P rise is not that important here. Actually, P rise, however, it's wrong. Actually, this is wrong. It will be Y rise because it's a price fixed model. So price rise, it's wrongly written. It will be Y rise. It's actually Y rise. It's not P rise. It's actually, I'm sorry. It's actually it's Y rise. So this is Keynes effect. That is, what does this mean? That government with increase in money supply, এটা কি বলছি আমি, that এটা ভুল বলেছি, এই সরি এটা পরেরটা আগে চলে এসেছে, সরি this is increasing money, এইটা পরেরটা, সরি এটা Keynes effect চলেছে, ভুল করে, সরি, this is, I'm sorry, this is, এখানে তো এটা এরকম নয়, সরি ছবিটা ভুল করে দিয়েছি, সরি, that this will be increase in money supply. So money supply rises. As money supply rises, this is the diagram, and this is the basic thing. I'm sorry. Money supply rises, the excess money is going to the bond market, price of bond is rising, rate of interest is falling, aggregate demand is rising, and your output is rising. Crowding out of, sorry. So there is rise in income. Why rises? And that we know. And what does this mean actually? Why it is important? Important in that sense that monetary policy, and in our next slide here, fiscal policy are effective in classical model. And why it is important? Keynes brings in government. Keynes shows that given the effective demand problem, given advanced capitalism, as in advanced capitalism there is inherent problem of effective demand, monetary policy and fiscal policy are effective. Means what? Means government is effective. And the contrary to the classical economists told us that government is irrelevant, Keynes brings in government, and government becomes extremely relevant in boosting up the economy, in boosting up the economy, in boosting up employment, in raising the level of employment, in dragging out the economy from depression. That is the contribution of Keynes. And for that, what is the fundamental contribution? Why I'm spending so much of time, that Keynes told us that, look, the way classical economists are portraying capitalism is wrong, because there is inherent problem of effective demand. And textbooks present things like, if there is effective demand problem, or something like this, Keynesian economics talks about effective demand problem as if it is something of the moon and Mars, and Keynes has had brought those things from moon and Mars. It's not like that. The evolution of capitalism generates the problem from within, the problem of effective demand. It's not that somebody from outside is telling, look, if there is effective demand problem, then government spending through money supply increase, or government spending directly by raising G, by government funding, tax, or other avenues like bond finance, etc. Bond financed government spending or money financed government spending are important if there is effective demand problem. This whole presentation is wrong. The fundamental issue here is that if you are in an advanced capitalistic scenario, then following even the, to some extent, naive logic of Keynes, that is absolute income hypothesis, AIH, that is consumption is a function of income with C prime greater than 0 less than 1, given that there is effective demand problem. But there are n number of reasons, other reasons, and for which you have effective demand problem, which are inherent. One I discussed, like skewed income distribution. That is, I think, should be clearly written in the textbooks, which is unfortunately absent. That it's not accident. It's not by chance that we have, if by chance the economy slips from the potential, then government becomes relevant. It's not like that. As if 2009-8-9 financial crisis is something which is very awkward, which is just accidental. If you look at the history of capitalism of last 200-300 years, continuously there is crisis, and that actually is the task of these theorists who are trying to tell us that, look, fundamental to capitalism is the effective demand problem, so you cannot remove government from the whole scene. The government has to govern, the government has to produce, the government has to, more importantly, production is not that important, more importantly, the government has to buy. The government either has to buy through bond financing or money financing. That is what is important for this. And what is important, then we go to the technical things, when there is deep depression and IS curve is vertical almost, then monetary policy is ineffective, but under usual condition, monetary policy is effective. So this is usual, general effective demand problem, then monetary policy is effective. When there is deep depression, then monetary policy is fully ineffective. I'm not going into all those chains, but if you ask, I can discuss definitely why, etc. But these are pretty general and textbook stuff. So next, you have similarly fiscal policy. When you have usual situation of depression, then basically the LM is very flat, IS is very steep. That is a cheap scenario of depression, and then fiscal policy is effective, highly effective. But when it is a booming economy, then fiscal policy is not effective, is not that effective. These are important because when we go to the next school of thought, this will be extremely important for your understanding. So just to remind you, I had to put these slides. Okay, next one. Another thing you have to keep in mind that from your textbook, this is absolutely textbook matter, that from ISLM framework, we have also aggregate demand. We can also derive aggregate demand curve. I think most of you know these things. Most of everyone should know these things, because you are not, you have all even the researchers are not past postgraduate. So it's obvious, the basic stuff. The point is that, very important, why it is, in all schools of thought other than classical, aggregate demand comes from ISLM framework. Let me tell you very clearly. SKM, CKM, SKM, ISLM, I'm sorry, not SKM, there's no this kind of scenario. ISLM, CKM, ISLM, CKM, monetarism, new classical rational expectation school, new Keynesian, for all these people, aggregate demand comes from ISLM framework. I'm sorry, it's not classical and not SKM. For SKM, there's no money, no question, and classical aggregate demand comes from money market. Why? Because there is no speculative demand for money, and there's only transaction demand for money. And why? Then, if there is transaction demand for money, then why from money market the aggregate demand is coming? There is no question of bond, there is no question of other things. Why? Because simple, money is held for transactions. So money is held for transactions against what? Commodities. So money is held for transaction means you are holding money for raising demand. So obviously, when money demand rises, when you are craving for money, when you are demanding money, why you are demanding money? For shares? No. You are demanding money just to raise demand for commodity. And that's why in classical model, money demand is equivalent to aggregate demand for commodity. And that's why we have that famous equation, M is equal to KPY, etc. Because money is held with one objective of as medium of exchange, money for transaction. But here money is held with two reasons. One is transaction, another is speculation. And that's why we have to have something like ISLM framework to arrive at aggregate demand for commodity. Is that clear up to this? And I'll go to complication. And we'll have once again policy debate. So what is the policy here? The policy is that what is the fundamental thing here? That when you enter Keynes is talking about a different context, and that is actually advanced capitalism. And when there is advanced capitalism, it is effective demand problem that is inherent. Why there is effective demand problem? That CI thing I have mentioned, that is purely Keynesian explanation. The non-Keynesian explanation is the skewed income distribution. Extremely skewed income distribution with very little income as a whole, aggregate income, to those people, millions of billions of people whose marginal propensity to consume is high, but most of the income, 90% almost, or 80%, 70% of the income is held by those whose marginal propensity to consume is very little. And that's why overall MPC is very low. And that's why obviously if you produce and even if you produce and generate income, your income won't be translated into demand, and there is always a inherent tendency of shortfall of demand. It's not an accident. And given this discussion, you will be surprised to know, I think many of the teachers know this, that if you look at the fantastic, very famous macroeconomics book by Barrow, then you would find maybe 23 or 30 number chapter is Keynes. And in many of the books, Keynes is just a footnote, because it's an accident. Because they consider effective demand problem is an accident, which is utterly wrong. That is my understanding, is that which is utterly wrong. Inherently advanced capitalism consistently, like cancer, it carries the problem called effective demand problem. It may come out, it may not, that is a separate issue, but it carries the germ of cancer called effective demand problem. That is what I intend to harp at, intend to focus on, because this is not mostly written. All these textbooks, almost never I have seen in the mainstream textbooks like Don Bush Fisher, Mankiw, or Romer, these things are written. That is, unfortunately, if we don't tell these things to our students, how will they be interested in macroeconomics? For them, it's a stale some model after model. In microeconomics, there is one framework. The same framework is getting repeated. And the same demand and supply is coming up all over again and again till general equilibrium before welfare economics part. In my undergraduate, in postgraduate. But in macro, we have so many schools. But why? Why so many schools? First of all, we need to tell the students that, look, there cannot be D theory. Even in physics, there is no D theory. There are at least two theories. For supraatomic world, there is theory of relativity. For subatomic world, there is quantum theory, or there is quantum mechanics, quantum theory, etc. So there is no grand theory. There is no grand unified theory. The string theory or something are just attempts. Even in physics, there is no theory. But when we teach microeconomics, we tell there is one theory. So in macroeconomics, there are so many theories because they are talking about so many contexts that we have to understand. Classical economists were talking about petty capitalism kind of situation, or nascent, just upcoming capitalism. Keynes was trying to talk about advanced capitalism, where already effective demand problem has become inherent, like cancer. So no question from this, I suppose. Now I come to CKM. You know all these things. Unfortunately, please pardon me for my very bad kind of handwriting. I'm trying to explain. So it's basically policy effectiveness once again. Monetary policy or fiscal policy is effective for Keynes, and it's in a Keynesian framework, complete Keynesian framework, and here what we add is labor market. So this aggregate demand that you see here is basically the from the earlier slide, we are getting the aggregate demand. This is our aggregate demand. This is the aggregate demand. We know all these things, and this is the aggregate demand. Now we are drawing the aggregate supply through this. When aggregate demand rises, given the aggregate supply, there is rise in price. So labor demand, labor demand is VMPL curve, and that's why employment rises. Now you put it on production function and you get higher level of output. So this is obvious. It's just textbook. Ackley is the best of Freund or Ackley. That is the thing. It's very simple. So it's nothing important here, except rather it's almost nothing important. But just to remind you that this we had, but we need this little later, because when we come to policy analysis once again, why Lord Keynes was so much in favor of government expenditure, money supply, etc., etc. Why? That is once again explained through the next not very tidy diagram. I suppose there is no confusion till this point, because we are slowly coming to modern macroeconomics, so-called modern macroeconomics, like monetarism, new classical and new Keynesian. May not be today, it will be finished. So tomorrow I'll start, no problem. But we need this grounding to understand the debate. And later part, when we go to monetarism, I'll try to present very briefly something which is not exactly there in the textbook. It's definitely the elements, some elements are there, but I will build on that. So please try to focus on this part, because it is not what I need for understanding Keynes or any on ISLM technically, but for two reasons. One is policy analysis, and the second one is the next part of macroeconomics. If you have to deal with that, you have to understand this part very clearly. And you understand, if you have any query, you can ask. Otherwise, I proceed. I suppose there is no question. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, so I go to the next part. Here, actually, we introduce, which is very common undergraduate question. We know that it's a very common undergraduate question, that is why money wage cut is not that important, is futile in complete Keynesian model. Show money wage cut is unable to increase employment and output. and the students write pages after pages very nicely, and they get very good marks. But unfortunately, why do we actually teach this? Why do we actually have this? And most of the textbooks don't have this, unfortunately, like Don Bushwitcher and Mankiw and Freund. Freund maybe you have, but otherwise you don't have. But why it is important? Because you just forget everything. Just look at the economy. You are in a situation of depression. Think of the economy. Forget, and or don't fully forget. Keep all the models and diagrams at the back of your mind. So you are faced with a situation where you find that there is great depression. You can't sell anything. So what you find? You find that you are not able to sell your produce. That means there is inventory. What do you do next cycle? You cut back production. And how do you do that? By reducing employment labor force. That means what? Retrenchment. Or you could actually reduce money wage, because it's a cost cutting method. It's a cost cutting. So you have to cut cost. You cannot earn profit. Or one thing, it can happen like this, that you are able to sell but at a lower price. You can dump your product in the market. What will you do with excess supply? So you sell your produce at a lower price, but your profit falls. So you have to reduce your money wage, because understanding is that if I reduce my money wage, then my cost is reduced. So I can maintain the whole thing, the whole production system. And by reducing, so it's basically the very market oriented logic. When you are unable to get the price, cut your cost. Otherwise, how can you maintain? Because price minus cost is profit. If you have to maintain your profit and reinvest and run the production and maintain the production, when price you are not getting price because of maybe demand side problems, then simply cut the cost and you can maintain your profit. And when profit is maintained, then you will invest. When you will invest, there's no problem of demand, because investment means two things. Supply side, you are creating capacity, and demand side, you are creating demand. So that is standard thing. And during depression, and that's why this is extremely important exercise. Why money wage cut is an extremely important exercise in Keynes, because it shows that under depression, money wage cut fails to hit the bullseye, fails to reach the target. By reducing money wage cut, nothing can happen. By reducing money wage, by introducing money wage cut, by reducing money wage, you cannot maintain your business. That is the background that we have to keep in mind. And what do I do when we discuss? It will be clearer. So initially, it is our A is the initial equilibrium. Here I spend some time. I don't know whether we know fully these things. So A is the initial point, NA is the initial employment, YA is the initial output, and this is your general equilibrium situation. Because you know why general equilibrium? Because at capital A, it is interaction between aggregate demand. Say let us take aggregate demand vertical. When it is vertical aggregate demand, we all know when there is depression, its aggregate demand is vertical, otherwise aggregate demand is downward sloping. And this is aggregate supply, so it's general equilibrium, because here we have commodity market equilibrium, money market equilibrium, bond market equilibrium, labor market equilibrium, but it's a very specific kind of labor market equilibrium where we have involuntary unemployment, and that's why we have this whole idea of underemployment equilibrium, blah blah blah. So we are here. Now we know this is involuntary unemployment. So there is lack of you are not able to utilize your productive forces fully. So you are having excess capacity unemployment scenario. Then what do? To resolve this, you just simply cut the wage. What will happen? Fantastic. That you are going here, because this is earlier it was labor market, and this is your labor supply. I'm sorry, this was earlier your labor supply curve. This is now your current labor supply curve. This is the new equilibrium. This is new employment. This is new output. And how does it happen? What is happening here? More of output is produced. Means what? Price has changed? No. So the same price, what has happened? Simply your output has increased from YA to YB. That means what? Your aggregate supply curve has shifted. Fantastic, no problem. Aggregate supply curve has shifted. Had there been aggregate demand curve like this, blue line that I'm drawing now, then the economy would have gone to B, and there is no problem. So when there is no, actually you are supplying, it's Say's law. Whatever you are supplying is getting demanded. Try to understand. This is actually the demand curve under Say's law. Why? Because you have cut wage, you have increased employment, simply you have used that in production, that additional employment, and your output is more, that is supply curve has shifted without any change in price, your initial price is P naught, and you are able to sell the whole thing because your demand curve is like this, horizontal. So it's a Say's law situation. This is your demand curve, don't forget. Say's law kind of situation. Is that clear? Had there been Say's law, had there been no effective demand problem, had there been a competitive equilibrium, had there been no advanced capitalism, had there been no monopoly capitalism, had there been no effective demand problem, had there been Say's law, that is whatever is supplied is automatically demanded, then there is no problem. Go for money wage cut. The standard neoliberal logic in every case, in every country that we are supplying is this. Go for money wage cut. But if there is effective demand, acute effective demand problem, and you know from our ISLM framework, you know that very well, that we teach our students every time that when depression, aggregate demand curve becomes vertical. We know that from our simple, because what happens? Simple, because LM curve is not this, in that context, LM curve will be horizontal. And whatever be that price change, M by P, even if M by P changes, so M by P is equal to, so that is your LM curve equation, M by P is equal to L1 of Y plus L2 of R. Most of you, almost everyone of you knows this. So when price changes, even if price changes, the equilibrium does not change. Means output does not change. This is basically not output. You know that from ISLM we get aggregate demand. So aggregate demand does not change. So when it is basically this. This will be the aggregate demand curve under deep depression. So when there is deep depression, what happens? Aggregate demand is the red line. Aggregate demand is actually the red line. Then the nice story of the neoliberals don't operate, simply. Because instead of coming to B, we simply go to C. Because now this is your aggregate supply and this is your aggregate demand. Means what? Price falls. Price nosedives hugely from P0 to P1, actually price falls. Huge fall in price does what? This is your VMPL, so it pushes back the whole thing to C. And there is no change in employment, no change in output. So the whole story of Say's law is completely nullified. So the structure of demand and the structure of the economy, you have to put in front of the students. Most of us may be doing that, but textbooks don't. It's very unfortunate. And even if you see, you have money wage cut in some of the textbooks, it is put just as a bizarre, peculiar case. Why, first of all, we discuss money wage cut, or Lord Keynes discussed money wage cut, to show that the marketist's logic, simple logic of cost cutting and maintaining business, maintaining profit, is absolutely a futile exercise in the face of effective demand problem under capitalism. So have you understood this? Is it clear? Maybe most of you have understood this, but still, if there is any question, confusion, please ask. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
So money wage cut is not just a question, 16 marks or 15 marks question, and people get mathematics like marks like mathematics sums. It's not that. It's absolutely value loaded. Neoliberal logic is money wage cut. This exercise shows that it's fantastic when aggregate demand curve is like this, horizontal, blue line. Whatever you supply, it is demanded. Supply creates its own demand. But if there is something else called advanced capitalism, monopoly capitalism, and effective demand problem, then whatever you supply is not automatically absorbed in the system, and that will push the price down to almost zero, and that will actually push this labor demand curve backward to the old situation. And what does this mean? Forget about the diagram. It's so simple. You are cutting money wage. Whose income you are cutting? The workers. Who are they? The main buyers of your economy. Then how can you maintain your sale? How can you maintain your zero inventory situation? So you are actually digging your own grave. This is why it's so important. And unfortunately, like Spectre, it comes back and back and back again and again to haunt us. Because advanced capitalism inherently carries the cancer germ called effective demand problem. In your trade models, what we do, two countries are trading. I am producing and exporting. Where is the guarantee that I will be able to sell this? There's no demand issue in general. How can it be possible? Is it a barter economy? Is it an economy of 17th century? And let me tell you very clearly, because at this moment I cannot resist the temptation, why there is effective demand problem. The fundamental problem is the class structure, and it's not inequality. The problem is that when you give money to people, then people consume, the workers, they consume. But they have very little. And when you give money to capitalists, they don't consume, they don't invest. Why? Because, and that's lead to actually the demand crisis, where the government has to step in to create demand. Why do they don't do that? Because they are not here, the capitalists are not here to consume, and capitalists are not here to create infrastructure for common people. They are here to make profit. If their profit is not guaranteed, if the accumulation is not, process is not guaranteed, they won't invest. They are not the people who are suffering from that kind of misery, poverty, or lack of consumption like that. And that is not the task of capital. That is not the task of capitalists, consumption and investment, unless and otherwise there is guarantee of profit. So you need a guarantor. And that's why time and again, like Avatar, like Krishna, like Vishnu, again and again, government arrives. During 1930s, if you look at global financial crisis and many crises in between, where government had to arrive as an avatar, because the problem is inherent. The understanding is that as if the accumulators, the capitalists, if you allow them to accumulate, as if they will automatically invest, which is absolutely a wrong understanding about the basic structure of the economy. That is actually pushing the textbook authors to present such naive models in the textbooks. And unfortunately or fortunately, our students are very intelligent, and then they understand what they are being taught in the name of macroeconomics is something very peculiar. So that is my assertion in this context. Hopefully you have understood this issue, that why money wage cut as an exercise, we should tell the students with a different context. Those of us do that, it's fantastic, no problem. So this is the issue, what Lord Keynes and others wanted to remind us, that look, government is extremely important, because in this context, who can save by pushing the aggregate demand curve? It is the government. The government can push the aggregate demand curve downwardly in this context, and thereby it can increase the demand, and actually it can check the price from falling. And then you can have money wage cut. So somebody has to be there. You can have money wage cut, provided there is someone. Otherwise, best strategy is not money wage cut. Best strategy and simple strategy is, in this context of effective demand problem, don't go for money wage cut. It's so simple that you just, because you're suffering from this effective demand problem, so you just push the aggregate demand curve. Push the aggregate demand curve. So that equilibrium is here. So that your output is here. And price rises. Price rises from P0 to say P3. And then when price rises, the VMPL rises, so the labor demand curve shifts. And you have more of employment. And that's why, true, there is some rise in price, but there is rise in employment and output. So money wage cut is futile, number one, that is the target of this diagram. And number two, to show, on the contrary, G rise is a much better strategy. With the caveat that there is inflation, but there is a rise in employment and the rise in output. Yes, there is inflation, but there is rise in output and employment, obviously. So it's a much better strategy. And on the other hand, it's not only much better, it's the only option rather, given the fact that money wage cut is completely futile. Is it fine? Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Now with this, so we are having two fighting groups. One is classical, one is Keynes. And Keynes and Keynesians showed us during 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s that government is extremely important. Now, what was happening? What was the trouble? It was an economy that is called capitalism. That is, it is meant for the capitalists. It was run by the capitalists. But unfortunately, Keynes and Keynesians were showing something very disastrous, horrendous, horrible. The capitalists were told that you can survive and sell and manufacture and produce and sell and accumulate if there is government. So basically, the capitalists are not leaders of the society. It is the government that is actually running the economy. So it's a huge debate. Government intervention is extremely important for the survival of the market economy, in particular capitalism. So capitalism becomes dependent on state. Capitalism's universal portrayal of capitalism as a supreme power is at stake. Capitalism becomes dependent on state, that is government. Without government, capitalism cannot survive. And that is, I am not going into that, stagnation thesis. Without capitalism, without government, there is inherent problem of stagnation. Because why? When Y rises, I does not rise, I does not rise commensurately, and then what happens? The gap between supply and demand continuously rises. Who will solve this problem of excess supply? It is government. If it is not solved, then capitalism's future is doomed. So you have to bring in government. So capitalism is becoming dependent on state. So it is losing its superpower character or portrayal, that it is the leader of the society, it drives everything, it is at stake. So when you bring problem of Keynesianism is that Keynes tried to help capital so that capital can survive, so that capital can do its business. But unfortunately, he created a Frankenstein. The state intervention continuous state intervention showed that capital becomes dependent, is inherently, fundamentally dependent on state. Classical economists, however, told that it is market, it is capitalism which is supreme. It does not need government. Government is rather a nuisance. But Keynes, by saving, in the process of saving capitalism, created a Frankenstein called government intervention, big G. So in this context, huge criticism, huge funding, and huge research had to be created to save capitalism, to save the face of capitalism. That how can it be so that capitalism is so dwarfed? It is dwarfed, okay? Choto kore debe, belittled. How capitalism be belittled? How capitalism be so naive? How capitalism be so powerless and dependent on government? That was actually the bone of contention during the 60s. And why it was so problematic, because there was something called Soviet Union and China who were doing marvel through state intervention. So capital was at stake. Hegemony of capital, supreme portrayal of capital as a supreme power was at stake. You had to resurrect capital. Fantastic spending was there, financing, funding was there for research, so that Keynesian economics could be dumped in the graveyard. Otherwise, there is no mukti, moksha from this dreaded theory of Keynesianism, which says that capitalism survives with the help of state. It cannot be an adult system. It is always a child. It is always dependent. Is that clear up to this? Then only I will proceed.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Sir, I
Yes,
have just queries that this
Yes.
kind of analysis we can use in current scenario of India, where there is huge unemployment, and in fact due to COVID, huge job cutting,
Now,
and
COVID is something else. COVID, don't bring in COVID. Before COVID, 2017, EPW, if you follow many articles, you would find 17, 18, unemployment rate was at the highest, post-independence, highest rate of unemployment. Forget
yes,
about COVID. Just before COVID. Why? Because it was, people were telling that it was a structural demand problem. And that is actually a variant of what Keynes was saying. It's different here. It's more of the second logic, skewed income distribution. That is the reason for effective demand problem in our case. It's not advanced capitalism logic. Its logic is the second one, skewed income distribution.
okay.
So I will end with this last thing, this one, today. And then if Daya Shankar allows, then tomorrow. Otherwise, we end with problems of Keynes and classes. Hello.
Yes, sir.
So আমি এইটা করে শেষ করব, ঠিক আছে?
Yes. Yes. Tomorrow again.
Okay.
You have to be start.
Okay. Problems of Keynes and classics. Key problem. So it's basically all these problems were posited by the critics, and the critics, what was the basic target of the critics? As we end tomorrow's lecture, it will be clear. The target was that government is just like classical, to show that government is redundant, market is supreme, capitalism is supreme and independent system. So we start with the problems. They are critic. And this aim and new, you don't have to look at now. Later on, we'll look at these things. Aim means monetarism. New classical means new. CL means new classical. M means monetarism. That means both of them, this point is valid for both of them. That is, both these schools of thought, both these groups of economists gave us this point. Similarly, this is also for both, true for both. Like this is true for only monetarism, and this is true for both monetarism and neoclassical. So it's not that important. I will tell these things later. First of all, let us look at the criticisms they raised. But if you look at the textbooks, you will find the criticism, not the background story. What is the basic argument then? What is the basic situation then? Government or no government? That is the question. So if you need state intervention or not, that is the billion-dollar question. And based on that question, supremacy of capitalism, whether it will stay or not, that depends. That is fundamental. So first there is the question, which is absolutely right, either short run, because Keynes was short run, classical was long run, but we need to have both short run and long run in one theory, and the journey from long run to another long run, from one long run to another long run, from one long run to another long run through short run. So basically we have to combine long run and short run, combine the two, otherwise we can't have a good theory. So that theory is a better theory which can explain more number of facts, higher number of facts. Why? So I started this lecture with the introduction that theory is a story. It is needed to explain reality. So if theory A can explain 2 types of situations, but B can explain 4 types of situations, then B is a better theory. That is how you should judge a theory. So you need a more comprehensive model where we can deal with both short run and long run. That is the first criticism. Second criticism was that these classical and especially Keynes was ad hoc macro without appropriate micro foundation. So they've said that these are ad hoc. There is no micro foundation. It's macroeconomics without micro. Why? As for example, why Keynes had W is equal to W bar? You know money wage rigidity. But they argued that unions know that if they put money wage higher than equilibrium money wage, W bar greater than W star, then there is a lot of involuntary unemployment. Then they will be in trouble. The union itself will be questioned by those who are not employed. Then how can the union maintain W bar greater than W star? This is illogical, because the market forces will bring down this wage. So high money wage despite involuntary unemployment is illogical. There is no micro foundation. Rational agents should behave rationally, as if everything is individualized. So every individual will be thinking in terms of his or her own understanding. So the people who did not get job will actually shout to reduce the money wage, push down the money wage, so that they can also get into the job. So this is ad hoc. These are ad hoc assumptions of rigidities. Like rate of interest is rigid. Why should it be rigid? Maybe in extreme conditions, accidental situations like depression, it is rigid. 1960s, it is going on. Think about the situation. Keep in mind it's 60s and basically 60s. That it is just a sudden accident. So basically, every rational agent should behave rationally, and the market is supreme. And this kind of ad hoc assumption that Keynes and Keynesians introduced are absolutely they lack micro foundation. So these cannot be scientific. These are ad hoc, unscientific models. Number 2. Number 3 is actually এটা এতটা দরকার নেই এখন, মানে একটা দিক থেকে দরকার, ইয়েস জাস্ট বলে নি, সেটা হচ্ছে when taking decision in classical, this is important, that when taking decision, এটা লেখা ঠিক মতো হয়নি, বলে দিচ্ছি মুখে, when taking decision, while taking decision in classical economics as well as in Keynesian economics, the individuals don't take into account future. Taking current decision, people should, rational agents should take care of future. At least should take a note of future. They are not blind people. They may not be able to see what will happen after 10 years down the line, but they should be able to predict at least next year what is going to happen. Otherwise, they are bad business people. So there is no role of expectation in classical and Keynes. Barring a few instances of setting investment, there is no expectation, role of expectation or dynamic role of expectation. This is important, this feedback, try to understand. Ad hoc expectation without any feedback effect of say PT plus 1E, that is expected price tomorrow on current price, or expected expenditure on current decision making, not only GT but also on YT. That is, when I am taking a decision, I have to always think about the future, but where is, and accordingly, as I see the future, I set the current decision. But this is absolutely absent in Keynes and classics. That is, future is not at all, almost not at all treated in current decision making. So while taking the decision at the current period, these people are almost completely forgetting future. How can it be so? And the last one, I will not discuss this, I'll start tomorrow with this. There was the real phenomenon called stagflation, which actually created or posed a very big question in front of Keynes and classics, especially Keynes. I will start with this, but I don't have time, it's 8 o'clock. And then tomorrow I shall start with, come prepared with those of you who are unfamiliar, not that familiar with the stagflation, etc. You please come with Philip Scarf, stagflation, these ideas. Actually, what is happening? I'm just telling you, not going into technicalities, that Keynes showed us that government expenditure can increase employment and output. But there was also increase in price. But these people, 1970s, this critic, the group of people, the critic of Keynes, especially Keynes, they took data and they used data to show that, look, when there is continuous increase in government expenditure, especially money supply, when there is continuous increase in money supply, instead of increase in output and employment, there is mostly increase in price. So stagnation with inflation. So what Keynes was telling, that money supply increase would be useful, government expenditure increase would be useful to increase employment and output. They showed with data, with econometrics, etc., data analysis, that it's basically pushing up price. So it's stagflation, just like what we had in our initial slide here. What we had in our initial slide here when we were discussing classical stagflation. This is stagnation with inflation. So there is, and those of all of you almost know that actually Keynesian aggregate supply curve is upward rising, and that's why we had this diagram, handwritten diagram, where we had aggregate supply curve, this diagram, aggregate supply curve upward rising instead of the classical vertical aggregate supply curve. So they are saying that, taking data, that look, Keynes told us that there might be some increase in price, but mostly there will be increase in employment and output. But here, what they showed, that using data, that it's mostly because of government money supply increase, there is mostly inflation. Maybe here and there are certain increases in terms of employment and output, expansions in terms of employment and output, but it's mostly inflationary. And that's why whenever there is inflation, they are trying to take the data and trying to tell the famous words of Friedman, that inflation is always and everywhere, and inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. So it's all because of money. It's not supply side rigidity or anything like that. It's too much of money that is actually creating the trouble. So once again, it is too much of government that is creating the trouble. So once again, the question of government intervention, to be or not to be, becomes the question. And with this, we will actually come to this tomorrow. This monetarism, that is actually, we will start with this column, and we will not look at this columns anymore, and this later. So we'll start with these columns. Okay. So with this I stop. But Shankar, there is no question. I'm very surprised. I think everything is known to everyone.
No, sir, there are two aspects.
Network.
I am listening like a film is going on. And the information I have input as you have given, and that was be processed, and later on they will ask the question. I think.
Okay. Let me see tomorrow then. Okay.
Yes, I am.
Tomorrow timing, sir?
Yeah.
Tomorrow timing, timing?
6.
For me, 6 to 8.
Okay.
6 to 8.
Okay.
Yes, tomorrow's Nidhi Madam session will be transferred to some other day. No worry.
Okay, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dayashankar. Thank you, everyone. But I would expect more questions.